So you've got 1 Corinthians written, 54, 55 maybe?
55, that's what I have.
2 Corinthians written perhaps a year or so later, perhaps in 2 or 3 chunks, but probably within the same year. So,
yes.
And then you've got 1 Clement a few decades later.
Yes.
Where are we thinking now?
Yeah,
so
40 years later.
You've got letters addressed to apparently the same community, or at least in continuation, the same community in the same place, where you get this apparently increasing expectation of their familiarity with a set of traditional texts, and by 1 Clement, explicit statements that they have been studying them. In fact, the way 1 Clement uses those terms like searching, Theologia, the oracles of God, that sounds very much like the way the Yahad talk about themselves too, doesn't it, in the community rule, the community of study and searching the scriptures, an association of people who engage in study. So I think that's really helpful, that controlled case study of a group of people addressed over several decades. And I think it is evident that Clement thinks they've been studying. One place where I would question further is still to say, okay, literacy is not 10% but 50%. I'm still interested to think through what do we mean by literacy there? So I think perhaps you're right. I mean, Paul clearly reads scripture. Sosthenes and Crispus, if they're the same characters as we get from Acts, because they seem to be referred to in 1 Corinthians, they seem to be high-ranking synagogue people from Corinth, so presumably they're pretty good at reading the scriptures themselves. But the whole community, the community as a whole, to say 50% literacy, are we saying half of them are just like Paul, Sosthenes and Crispus in being able to sit down and read scrolls? Or are we saying more that 50% of the congregation are comfortable with a bookish ethos within which these traditional oracles are discussed and disseminated? I'm almost wondering whether, are these Corinthians a bookish circle, or are they more an oracular circle, where they live in an ethos of oracles? Oracles from Isaiah, from Jeremiah, from Moses. These are the oracles of God. So they are written, they are preserved in scrolls and carefully read by some members of the community. Perhaps the kind of literacy, the lowest common denominator literacy in the whole group, might be a kind of literacy where they are deeply engaged in this traditional set of oracles, which they know to be preserved in texts. But not everyone is necessarily able to sit down, roll out the scroll and read it like Paul can.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm not quite satisfied with gauging the level of literacy, and I'm not producing anything new in this study on it. But I'm trying to work with the categories that are out there, and I'm not satisfied with it. But I like your idea of thinking of, let's say, a bookish circle versus oral. It seems that it is more of a bookish circle by the time you get to 1 Clement, in that you have you're studying and you're working more with textual materials at that point.
Yeah, it seems like in the way that the Yahad would say, we search the scriptures with darash. These people, I don't know what searching term is used by Clement in Greek. Is it ekniazo or something like that?
Yeah, well, no, actually,
or zait.
Which is different. In 31, it's Anna to lixomize.
Yes.
That is the same as your translation gives.
Well, the search I have in 1 Clement 53 is, sorry, it's my eyes. Yeah, ekekufate.
And that's not in 33?
No, it's not in 33, but it's in 53. Yeah, so he's used two different terms.
At several places, different terms. So we have to look whether it's really a semantic field of interpretation there.
Yeah.
So you are a little bit pushing the studying too much, I think. You are a little bit pushing the study a little bit too much.
I'm fine with that. But they weren't studying at the time that Paul wrote in 2 Corinthians. So neither of those words are used.
I'm not so sure about that too.
In 1 and 2 Corinthians?
So the whole setup of one. So you say. Now let me start with the beginning. You use Acts as an historical source before you go to Paul, telling us that there are some Jewish people in the Corinthian congregation.
Yes.
I would be less. I would be more careful to use Acts for explaining 1 Corinthians in that sense. You can. So Acts is an explanation of 1 Corinthians. That's not the source for 1 Corinthians. Still, I agree with your idea that there are Jews, and possibly more than only a few Jews in the Corinthian congregation. But I would like to argue that from 1 Corinthians itself.
Okay.
And so that's more important. And then later you can find some corroboration from Acts. But I would not dare to start with Acts. Sorry for that. But the whole point is, and let's be focused on that, what you say about the knowledge of the Corinthians, knowledge of the biblical narrative. And that suggests that your category textuality is there. If you look, for instance, there is only 1 references to non-biblical literature. So you live in Corinth, and there is not any references to classical literature, and also not in 1 Clement. So only in the 3rd century Christians start to refer to classical literature, which suggests that the whole gist of the community is focused on, let's follow your term, textuality, and the textuality is biblical textuality. Even in 1 Corinthians 10, the famous passage, you find there midrashic references to midrashic interpretations. So not to Scripture, but to the interpretation of Scripture, of Jewish interpretation of Scripture. So I would like to say, I don't know how many Jews there were, but they were doing Jewish things, which is more important than that we know how many there are, because we don't know, and we will never know.
That's fine. Yeah, I mean,
I could be a little bit more careful on that. That's
Too much
no. There are some Jewish elements, but I think you're in agreement with me that the church is largely Greco-Roman.
I don't know. I really don't know. And even if they are Greco-Roman, they are attuned as Greco-Roman persons to Jewish stuff.
yes.
And I think we will hear all about this, in fact, when you speak.
No,
Some of these
small, so a little bit more. There's far more in it. I am only dealing with the detail. But for instance, 1 Corinthians 10 is very important. And then you really think midrashic stuff, which is not in the Scripture, but it is in Jewish rabbinical traditions.
Yes, that's a good point.
I want to open the question also to Ingo, who has
I want to follow a little bit the track you went. You're totally right. There are a lot of scriptural references, but you always say they. And I would really ask, who are they who really dealt with it? If you have I think you even need more than 10% in a community to be literate, to read such letters and then explain it to the less literate person.
performance. It's a performance.
Yeah, it's a performance. I think this letter was read out to the congregation, and if there was something was alluded to, then the people would say, yes, I explained it to you. So I think in the extreme, you need only one person who understands it and can explain it to the others. So this would prove that there are literate people, there are people who deal with the texts, the Clement and Paul is alluding to, but this doesn't say anything about the amount of the people who are there, because you say it as yourself, maybe 50%, so there were at least 50% who needed to be explained. This because they couldn't read. So I think it's I think we should not underestimate the layer of the function of educated people who explain to the uneducated people what they need. And to give an example, if I can't remember, it's my fault, where Paul does it, but yes, if I remember right, he once referred to this midrash of the wandering well in the...
That's the passage I refer to. 1 Corinthians 10.
Yeah. So does this mean that his audience knew Jewish midrashic texts? No, but probably there was one who could then tell this story, because if someone, what is Paul speaking about, there would be some people that they could tell the story, and that only a small amount of educated people are needed. And the second point, all these arguments against, these arguments in favor for higher literacy, as far as I see, are using texts which normally come from a higher level of society, and not from a level of society of servants, of slaves, and so on. So I have sometimes a feeling that the discussion and the try to push up the number of literacy really forgets that there was a great base of people never show up in this text, even not show up in economic texts, because they just went under the radar. We have this in a lot of communities. To give an example, we have written texts of dowries and such things, but this is always for the upper part. We have no dowry, we have no personal document for any person which is not a free person. So it's especially my field. So I think maybe it's a misunderstanding that we argue there's a lot of texts, so the literacy must be higher. And I think it was you said this with this that in the documents literacy only starts at a special amount of money involved. Who did it in this? With this?
Well, no, I think this is Harris's argument that. But I mean, that wasn't. I mean, this is Harris's argument that it's only at a certain amount of money you have people signing for their own receipts of that, receipts for having been given that amount of money.
It's the same in Persian time and so on. It needs a little bit. It needs a certain economic level that Scripture starts.
But we have receipts for amounts lower than that money, and Harris's argument is that people couldn't sign for themselves of that money. But that doesn't seem to me proof that they're illiterate. I mean, we saw in Lindsay's evidence yesterday, and you've seen some of the Pompeian evidence, that you every now and then get a formula that says, and I have signed for X because they are illiterate. But the majority of this stuff, it doesn't say that. It just has somebody signing for another person. And personally, I don't think that means that you are proving illiteracy, because I think your problem also counts for people who are trying to prove low levels of literacy, that they're also relying on texts that aren't dealing with these people from the bottom half of society. It's not like people have found, someone going, I can't write anything, written on a piece of evidence. It's just sort of, it's difficult.
Well, yeah, I appreciate you bringing up the question of they. All right, how many people were literate or not? That might be difficult to answer, but the trajectory is moving more towards literacy and textuality with all these examples, from the citations.
Textuality, I would agree from very beginning. That's clear. But this is the same as literacy. Textuality is the same as literacy.
Well, that's what we need to distinguish. I have a reply. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I think it's very easy for us constantly to slip back into when I talk about literacy, and I think many of us easily slip into this habit. We're thinking in terms of what we do. We live in a post-Reformation age, and the Reformation was the one in which we inherit this idea that individuals should study for themselves. And it comes out of the Lutheran and the Protestant project. The individual should read in the vernacular and discover for themselves. We live in an age of technological printing, which is now extremely advanced. We live in an age of state-funded education, so all of us read. So we all read privately. We can read novels. The novel exists for us, for example. We sit and read novels, and it informs us personally. We grow as people as we read novels. Whereas the literacy, and actually I think you've shown that in this particular Corinthian community over its development over several decades, it becomes increasingly a community whose ethos is one of study. So, yes, there may have been 10% of people who could sit down and read like you or me, like just read a novel by Dan Brown or Isaiah. There may have been 90 or 80 or 70% of people who simply could not sit and read a text off a manuscript. And yet that 70, 80, 90% of people who could not read a manuscript are still very much immersed in an ethos of studying these prophetic oracles from God. So, in a sense, we need to think much more in terms of a communal context, and not one in which simply the literate explains to the illiterate, and the illiterate just simply sits there like the cow again that I read my lecture to, sits there completely mute, neutral recipient of this teaching from the literate one, but all of them are engaged in a community ethos in which they are immersed in the idea of studying these oracles. Yes, they happen to be written down and somebody's got to read them out, but maybe all are engaged in this environment of thinking about them. And your word is very nice, their attunement. They are attuned to a certain style of approaching them, which has a lot of Jewish exegetical, midrashic flavours in it, So less private, less personal, less post-Enlightenment printing press type reading, literacy.
I like your word ethos. I think that's helpful, and I guess in my response is which way does it tend to favor? Does it tend to favor more towards literacy, more towards textuality, or less towards literacy and less towards textuality? I think it's clearly going one way.
It's a question from ignorance, really, so apologies if it is ignorant, but another complicating category or subcategory of literacy is multilingual literacy. And these texts are all in Greek, and the quotations are all in Greek. So by this date, is the Greek translation of the Jewish scripture just totally stable and non-controversial, or is there some dispute about translation? And is there a sense in these Jewish communities that literacy in Greek is fine, but that a really competent, clever elder or rabbi or tutor might also be able to be literate in other languages and get back to the original texts?
We're largely with the Septuagint here.
And this is, by this date, just universally accepted as a stable text.
Yeah.
Jews are spread all around the Mediterranean and outside Judea. It seems that many of them are simply happily reading a Greek translation. The Septuagint, as we know it, isn't the only Greek version. There are a few competing Greek versions, and there are some scholars in this period trying to conform the sense of the Septuagint back towards the emerging standard Hebrew text emerging at the time, where they have diverged in sense. But still, that's a really technical edge.
There's no discourse about multilingualism in this traditional commentary on Scripture.
Not evident.
No, not in 1-2 Corinthians or Clement, no.
Maybe Justin, Origin, Jerome start to talk about Hebrew, Greek, this translation, that translation, but that's a few centuries later.
That's on the way.
Oh, something small. You say somewhere take the Greek word is analabeta, and I would like to suggest that you can translate it with take it again and again and again, and then you find a nice idea about how they dealt with text. So it's not just labeta, it's a repetition, and those people took that letter of Paul again and again and again. It was their letter. And so I think that quite a lot of people knew that letter because it was read for them time and again.
Yes. Thank you. I should add that point.
Yeah.